Just as I am, though tossed about with many a conflict, many a doubt, fightings and fears within, without, O Lamb of God, I come, just as I am, thou wilt receive, wilt welcome, pardon, cleanse, relieve, because thy promise I believe, O Lamb of God, I come, I come.
It's a beautiful Lord's Day, and I'm glad to see you're here. I'm sure we'll have several drift in later who maybe didn't set their clocks on the time change. We have been studying the life of Christ now for over a year, and we have finally come to the point of Jesus' crucifixion. The Apostle John wrote in chapter 21, verse 25, "Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." We have preserved for us in the four gospel accounts the life of Christ. And we have studied and studied from the prophecy of Jesus' birth all the way up to his judgment by Pilate and being turned over to the Jews. Remember last week, Pilate washed his hands and said he would not be responsible and turned Jesus over to be crucified as the Jews expected. Because when he told them he found no guilt in the man, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." So Pilate washes his hands and turns Jesus over to be crucified. Now, there are several things that had to happen right away. The instructions for the crucifixion had to be given. The Roman soldiers had to be assigned that specific task of execution. The paperwork had to be done. There was a sign painted to go over Jesus' head on the cross. And I want us to open our Bibles to Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23. And we're going to read the account of Jesus leaving the praetorium where Pilate turned him over to be delivered for crucifixion all the way up to Calvary. So let's begin reading Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 26. "And as they led Jesus away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, 'Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they would do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?' 2 others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him." And when they came to a place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. So we start this possession out of the praetorium on the way to Calvary. And Jesus and the two criminals are in this possession. The Roman soldiers are in this possession. And then there's a crowd of women and others following. Now, Jesus is bearing his cross. And they're headed towards the crucifixion. And right before he departed the praetorium, remember the Roman soldiers took him back and put the purple robe on him and mocked him and pushed down the crown of thorns upon his head. Normally, it's not like rosebush thorns. It's thorns that are anywhere from 1 to 3 inches long. And you can imagine them pushing that down and it just cutting into the skin around his head. So we have blood running down his face. And they ripped the purple robe off of him. Remember, he has been scourged. And the point of scourging was to bring them as close to death as possible without killing them. And they had ripped his back open and chunks of flesh had come off. And they put the purple robe on him and his back basically coagulated with the purple robe. So his back is dried to the robe and they rip it off. Imagine the tremendous amount of pain ripping that robe off caused. And they put his clothes back on him. And they led him out to be crucified. Now, Jesus is bearing the cross. When we think of the cross, we think of a T, a lowercase t, and the weight of the whole thing was probably around 300 pounds. But custom of that day is they would carry the crossbar. Now, we see pictures everywhere of Jesus dragging the cross behind him. But the custom was just to carry the crossbar, and it probably weighed anywhere between 75 and 125 pounds. Now, your back has been ripped open. You have been up all night long. You have been abused and mistreated. You're barely able to stand, and they lay the crossbar on your back for you to take. Jesus was unable to carry it the whole distance. Why? Because of everything he had endured. A whole night of abuse, the scourging. You know, most criminals did not survive the scourging because it killed them. And so as they're on the way out, soldiers found a replacement to carry him. Look at Mark 15, Luke, and turn back to Mark chapter 15. And let's notice down in verse 21, Mark 15, verse 21. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry the cross. Apparently, Mark thought that they would recognize Simon from his sons, Alexander and Rufus, by pointing them out. But it says they compelled him. Roman soldiers could compel anyone to do any labor of work they desired. Remember, they were told if they asked you to go a mile, then go 2. So here they see Jesus stumbling, trying to carry the cross and thinking, we're never going to make it. So they compel Simon into service. There are 2 views here. One view is that Simon took the piece and carried it himself behind Jesus. Another view is that Simon took the part dragging the ground and picked it up and put on his shoulder, and the front part of the end being on Jesus' shoulder. And they carried it between the 2. But when you think of the cross, there were 3 types of crosses. One was an X, one was a capital T, and one was a lowercase t. Well, how do we know which one it was? Well, it says there was a sign hung above Jesus' head that read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." It couldn't have been an X because there'd be no place to hang the sign above his head. If it was a capital T, there would be no place to hang the sign. So with it being the lowercase t, that makes the most logical conclusion of which it was, because there would be space to hang the sign up there. It's interesting that Simon of Cyrene was compelled, because once we get to the book of Acts, we read that there were many Cyrenian Christians that helped spread the good news about Jesus Christ. Think of the impact this must have had on Simon, to watch everything occurring and seeing Jesus struggling and nearly falling to his feet trying to carry the cross. And then all of a sudden he's compelled to help lead a man off to be crucified. We must remember, when we think about Jesus trying to carry his cross, that Jesus was in the flesh. And he had to suffer the same human weaknesses we do. Have you ever been severely traumatized or severely injured and then expected to carry a great load? So Jesus is in his human body. When we think of Simon of Cyrene, who knows where Cyrene was? Yes. Absolutely. It's on the northern coast of Africa. Cyrene was the capital of Libya. So Simon has come from the northern coast of Africa, and he's compelled to carry the cross. Now, when we talk about the trip from the Praetorium, the most common route is the Via Dolorosa. It's when tourists go there today, they walk the route of the Via Dolorosa. Via Dolorosa means way of sorrows. And why did they choose that route? Often they chose the longest route that was there to make them suffer even greater. But they also chose the most crowded streets to travel. Now, why would the Via Dolorosa be so crowded? Because over 1 million people are in the city for Passover. So all the people from the other nations are crammed into the city, and the Via Dolorosa being a major thoroughfare, Jesus is being taken through an extremely crowded section. So for the Romans, it drew everyone's attention to what happens to someone who violates the Roman law. Let's go back to Luke 23. Luke 23. And as they're going, Jesus has interaction with a group of women. Look what he says to them again, beginning in verse 8. But verse 27 says, there will follow him a great multitude of people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. Not necessarily because they believed in him, but because of the physical torture he was enduring and what was about to occur. But turning to them, Jesus said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." Now, that was a very unexpected interaction. They were probably taken back. What do you mean, weep for ourselves and weep for our children? Jesus says, "For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed." It was a tremendous and painful experience for a woman at that time not to be able to bear children. And here is saying, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. Remember how Sarah was going so long in her and Abraham's life, and finally, after the age of childbearing, she found out she was going to have a child, and she said her reproach would now be removed. So all of a sudden, what was considered a reproach, Jesus says, is going to be a blessing. Now, what did he mean when he said, verse 31, for if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? Jesus says, if they will do this to me while I am alive, think of what they'll do to you when you're dead. Because the city of Jerusalem, what they would do to the wicked, if they'll do to this to me, a righteous man, what do you think they'll do to you who are wicked? He considered himself as a green, living thing, and them as dead, dry wood. It's a forecast of the judgment coming upon Jerusalem. He says, if they'll do this to a righteous man, what are they going to do to the wicked? And remember, the Jews rebelled against Rome. And in AD 70, approximately 40 years later, the Roman army came in and destroyed Jerusalem. So Jesus turns to them and stresses that they need to be weeping for themselves because judgment is coming upon them. Yes, sir.
These are words that Jesus also spoke that we have in Matthew 24 as he prophesied about the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yes.
For the women to hope that it's not a time when they're nursing you.
Yes. When Jesus prophesied about the destruction of Jerusalem, to pray that you're not nursing at the time you flee because of the difficulty of the traveling the child would be. But now he says, when the Romans come back and destroy you who are so wicked and spiritually dead, think how much faster you're going to burn up. You know, a green tree can burn up in a forest fire, but a dead, dry one just goes up in flames, just like that. So Jesus is forecasting, the language is language of terror, because judgment was going to be so frightening and the conditions would be so fearful that the people would even cry out for the mountains to fall on them and the hills to cover them. Do anything to deliver them out of what is occurring. So it says, verse 33, and when they came to the place that is called the skull. Does your translation have any other thing mentioned there when they come to the place of Golgotha? Calvary? Basically, Golgotha and Calvary mean the skull. But it says when they came to the place of the skull. In Latin, it is Calvary. In Hebrew, it is Golgotha, and if I'm not mistaken, I got that written down somewhere. In Greek, it was the other one. I'll come to it in a minute. But in the place of the skull, which is in Hebrew called Golgotha, and in Latin called Calvary. So in Greek, it's the place of the skull. Now, there's four things or four criteria that have to be met in identifying the place of the skull or where Jesus was crucified. First, we're told it was outside the city gates. So in identifying the place, it has to be outside of the city gates. John tells us in chapter 19, verse 20, that it was near the city. So it has to be outside the gates, but near to the city. It said it had to be near a road or a busy thoroughfare. Because remember, those passing by hurled up insults and mocked Jesus on the cross. and it had to be in the vicinity of a garden and a tomb area. There are two places pointed out today. Many believe that it was the place is where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is. In the first century, when they started destroying holy sites, they would build churches over them. And the other place is Gordon's Calvary, because looking at it, it kind of looks like a skull. But those are the two places identified today as the most possible locations of where Jesus was crucified. Now, let's go to Mark 15. They have arrived to the site, and let's notice what takes place when they reach Calvary. Mark 15, and let's begin reading in verse 22. And they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And one of those who passed by derided him, and those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha! You who will destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down to the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also derided him. When they got there, they stripped off their clothing. And remember, the soldiers at the foot of the cross cast lots to see who got what piece of clothing. The soldiers got whatever remained of the individual, and they got to take the clothing of Jesus. It says that he and the two thieves were offered a drink mixed with myrrh, or wine mixed with myrrh. It had a deadening or a numbing agent, and it would help you bear some of the pain. But Jesus refused it because he wanted to have the full experience of the crucifixion in which he was partaking to save the world lost in sin. So he refused this wine mixed with myrrh because he did not want to interfere with what was planned. It says Jesus declined the painkiller. Well, they crucified two robbers with him. Early readers understood how much was included with the word crucified. When they got there, the bar they were carrying was laid on the ground, the wooden bar. They were stretched out, and they ran a spike through each hand. Now, in the first century, the wrist was considered part of the hand. Most believe that he was pierced through his wrist to be able to hang there. And Thomas asked, "Well, unless I see the prints of the nails in your hands," well, they believed that the wrist was part of the hands. The other view is he was pierced directly through the palm of his hand. But it would not, piercing in the wrist hit every nerve that could cause pain. So whether he was pierced directly right there in his wrist or in the palm of his hand has often been greatly debated. But his arms were stretched out. He was nailed to crossbeam, and then that was hoisted up and attached to the perpendicular place already standing in the ground. They say the perpendicular one was left in the ground so people constantly had a reminder as they crossed by what occurred to those who broke the law. So they hoist him up, and then they take his feet, they push up one leg and bend the knee and put his foot flat against the pendulum, and then they put the other foot on top of it. So he's got one foot on top of another, and they drive a stake straight through both of them to nail his feet to the cross. Now, some believe that there was a little piece of wood right there that he could rest his bottom on as he hung. That's up for debate. But the point of hanging there with his feet nailed, when he got so tired of hanging, it would become difficult to breathe. So he would have to push up to be able to get air in his lungs, which caused, again, severe pain. The Romans perfected crucifixion. Oh, they had crucified people for years before, but the Romans perfected it and figured out the way to cause the most pain possible for the ones hanging there. And often they hung for 2 or 3 days before they died. But here we are, he's hanging on the cross, and the two robbers with him. Look at Isaiah chapter 53. Isaiah chapter 53, basically the whole chapter prophesies about the crucifixion. But in Isaiah chapter 53, down in verse 12, it says, "Therefore I will divide him a portion with many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors." It says he was numbered among the transgressors. He was hung between two transgressors. So the two robbers crucified with Jesus fulfilled prophecy. Now, let's talk about the sign that was hung above Jesus' head. We noticed in Luke's account in chapter 23, it says, there was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." But you have to put all 4 accounts together to get the total writing that was on the cross. Because when we put all 4 Gospels together, this is Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Now, when Pilate had that hung up there, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews," it greatly insulted the high priest. And they said, "You need to change it to say, 'Who claimed to be the King of the Jews.'" And Pilate refused. They had pushed Pilate's hand on crucifying Jesus, and Pilate basically had to jab back. And he refused to change it. Pilate said, "What is written shall be written." So let's go back to Mark 15. Mark 15, down in verse 25. It says, "And it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him." What time was the 3rd hour? 9 o'clock in the morning. Well, how do you get 9 o'clock is the 3rd hour?
6 in the morning is the 0 hour.
The beginning of the day. The Jews counted time from 6 a.m. forward. So 6 to 7, 7 to 8, 8 to 9. 9 would be the 3rd hour. 12 would be the 6th hour, 6 to 12, and 9 and the 9th hour would be 3 p.m. So we know Jesus is hung on the cross at 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, he's already been through the Roman trials much earlier that morning. And he's been up all night, and now he is hung at the 9th hour. One of the genius, if you can call it genius, things about crucifixion and suffering is it did not touch a single major organ when they were crucified. So that prolonged the time of hanging on the cross. A victim could live for days with throbbing pain, fever, tortured by thirst, fighting off birds and insects. And the hardest part was how hard it was for a victim to breathe, not including the pain and the cramps and everything else. And this is just the start of the 6 hours Jesus hung on the cross. Let's go to our question sheet for our lesson today, because it points out key facts that we should be well aware of when we think about Jesus being led from the Praetorium to Calvary. Approximately how much did the crossbeam weigh that Jesus carried? Approximately 75 to 125 pounds. Have you ever carried a 50-pound bag of feed? Ever carried a 100-pound bag of feed? It's not light. I used to carry 50-pound bags of chicken feed all the time. And so it is quite a weight. It says, when Jesus was unable to carry the weight of the crossbar for the whole distance, who was forced in to carry it the rest of the way? Simon the Cyrene. What was the traditional path to Calvary called, and what does that name mean? The Via Dolorosa, and it means the way of sorrows. So what did the words of Jesus directed at the weeping women refer? To the upcoming destruction, the upcoming judgment upon Jerusalem in the destruction in AD 70. What were the three names of the place of Calvary, or the place of crucifixion? Calvary, Golgotha, and the place of the skull. What process was followed when they reached the place of the skull? First, they stripped off the clothing. They were offered a numbing drink. Their arms were stretched out and staked to the beams. And then they were hoisted up and placed on the perpendicular piece of the cross. What did the sign above Jesus' head say, and in what languages was it written? This is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. What three languages? Aramaic, Greek, is, okay, in Aramaic is Hebrew? No. It's Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Hebrew, because that was the language of the Jews. Latin, that was the language of the Romans. And Greek was the common language that everyone spoke Koine Greek at that time. So regardless of who passed by, they would be able to read what was written on the cross. When the chief priest objected to the sign above Jesus' head, what did Pilate say? He refused to change it. He left it as it was. Crucifixion had been used for many centuries, but who perfected it as a form of torture and capital punishment? The Romans. And then, according to the Journal of the American Medical Association, what was the major effect of crucifixion? Excuse me? Scourging him? Asphyxiation. Yes. Okay. Comments on his way to the cross. Do you think there were insults being hollered out on the way to the cross? Do you think that the women understood what he told them? No. Yes, sir.
One of the things that I find very interesting is the trail of the crosses, where Jesus is extremely high up off the ground, and the impossibility of being able to get him up there, and also of being able to offer the strength to him on his side.
Yes, it was pointed out that Jesus being hoisted up on the cross, how difficult that probably was. There's debate about how tall the cross was. Some people believe his feet were only about 2 feet off the ground. Many believe that he was way up in the air. Now, if he was way up there, they would have to use a rope, basically, to hoist him up, to get him high enough to be nailed up. So the tremendous pain just in being hoisted up was there as well. Okay? Other comments? You know, yes, ma'am. The comment was made trying to think about the worst time in the person's life that they were physically hurt, that was nowhere near comparison to what Jesus was enduring. Not only was it physical pain, but it was also emotional pain. You know, normally when we're in the hospital, when we're in such pain, they deaden everything to get us out of pain. But there was no relief of pain for Jesus.
And you know, there's part of this we can't really relate to because we're human. It's the fact that he's going to be separated from his Father. And I have no idea what that would be.
Yeah. The thing we cannot relate to is that we're human and trying to relate to the fact that Jesus is going to be separated from his Father, which he had never, ever experienced. And we'll get to that when we get to where he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? We talk about the crucifixion of Jesus, but when we think about it and talk about it, rarely do we bring up or think about the excruciating torture which Jesus went through just to be crucified for us. I mean, it was no easy route to the cross. And remember, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed, begging the Father, if possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will be done, but thy will be done. Let this cup pass from me. Let what is about to occur, all the torture and pain and suffering and crucifixion, if there's any way mankind can be saved without me having to do that, let that be. But then he said, nevertheless, not my will be done, but thy will be done. So Jesus knew the excruciating pain he was about to endure. And it was horrific. We have never seen such torturous putting to death in our lifetimes in the United States. You know, now it's by lethal injection. It used to be by the electric chair, and that could be horrific to view when difficulties occurred. But we have not seen someone nailed to a cross after scourging. I don't think we could watch someone being scourged. When we see the skin being ripped open and chunks of flesh being ripped out of the back. But then we haven't seen someone crucified and hung up to die. And we haven't seen animals picking at a live person and things along that nature. We think about his crucifixion, and yes, Jesus died for me, but we rarely mention what he endured in that process. So our God endured severe torture and pain just so we could be saved. And the only thing we're required to do is repent of our sin and obey the gospel. Okay, any other comments on leading Jesus to Calvary? Next week, we will get into what occurs in the next 6 hours. And so be sure to read the text for next week. Have you already handed out next week's sheets? Yes, okay, you all have the sheets. Be sure to read that. If you haven't read any other lesson, be sure to read that one. And be sure to do your worksheet for that one. Okay, any other comments or questions? Then thank you for your attention, and I look forward to worshiping with you in the next hour.